Thank you. Here tonight presenting our district budget update is our district's Chief Financial Officer, Dave Montoya. Dave, welcome.
Thank you, Brian. Good evening, board. Tonight, we're going to get the presentation up here. Tonight, we're going to be presenting a budget update. For those that have been on the board for a while, you know this is the cadence we get into with the legislative process. So this is one of our first updates of many through the spring as we learn what's happening with the legislative process and how our budget's going to come together. So tonight, we're going to do some foundational setting. We're first going to talk about the school finance formula as it currently exists. Spending just a little bit of time with this to orient the board around how the school finance formula currently works, because as you're going to see later in this presentation, there's going to be possible changes on the horizon. So setting foundational understanding is helpful. We'll look at some possible revenue scenarios. I think it's really a scenario, and I'll talk about the options that may come around there. We'll revisit our budget priorities that were established, and we'll revisit our budget timeline. So starting off, let's just talk about the revenue sources that the school district gets. And when I'm talking about revenue sources, primarily we talk about general fund revenue, but we also do receive federal, state, and local grants at times. So those are an addition often to the general fund. But tonight we're going to focus mostly on general fund, as it's the biggest driver in our budget. And general fund is our fund where we do most of our operations out of. So this is our general operating account. When we look at the general fund, there's a couple categories of revenue that we receive. The first one is, and I put it under state revenue, but School Finance Act actually has both state revenue and local property taxes, which we're going to see that in some detail. So School Finance Act is one of the biggest drivers in our budget. And when you look at the general fund budget, about 73% of our budgeted revenue in general fund comes from the School Finance Act. As you heard me open this presentation up, and as I'm going to be mentioning along the way, there's an avenue and opportunity for some major changes to the School Finance Act. That's why we're spending a little bit of time with it tonight. So again, that makes up about 73% of our revenue. Some of it is state revenue, but some of it is also property tax. And I've got a graphic that'll help you understand that later in the presentation. Under state revenue, we also get categorical funding. We don't talk about these as often. It's about 5% of our general fund revenue. But there is program-specific funding that we get, and it's called categorical funding. Moving down below, we have local property taxes, both property taxes and specific ownership tax. Specific ownership tax is the tax that, that's the question I get. I think most people understand what property taxes are, but specific ownership tax is primarily vehicle registrations. There's other things in there, but primarily driven by when we go and register our vehicles, there's a tax there. Over on the local revenue side, we do have additional revenues that come into general fund beyond school finance formula or the categorical funding. And this section has grown some, especially after the 2019 mill levy override. In our local revenue, we have mill levy overrides now totaling about 17% of our general fund revenue. So it's really important to pause for a second to think about the funding that we get from the state formula, but also the additional support that we get from our local taxpayers. And that comes in the form of mill levy overrides. And again, it's providing a 17% or 17% of our budget that would not be there otherwise without local voter support. And it really is what makes PSD who PSD is from a financial sense. Okay. We also have other revenues within these categories, but if you were keeping tabs, I talked about 73% coming from School Finance Act, 5% coming from categorical, and then about 17% coming from mill levy overrides. So we've talked about the majority of our revenue pretty quickly there in those categories. I do want to point out we do get other local revenue, like building rentals, athletics. There's a whole host of items, and you can see those outlined in our budget document. Again, we do get federal grants, and we do have state and local grants, but the big driver there is the federal grants, but we do get grants at times. So the first step I want to do is take a broad lens approach to the state's budget, and I thought the best way to do that would be to look at a pie chart. And what this pie chart represents is the breakdown of the state's budget because this is important. It feeds into our total program. And about 13.9 billion of the state's general fund is displayed on this pie chart. When we look at the big drivers in the state's budget, you can see that education makes about 32% of this pie. Healthcare policy and financing makes up 29%. Higher education, 10%. Human services, 8%. And judicial and corrections total up about 11% in total together. And then there's another category, all or other, of which includes all sorts of things at the state budget that are multiple little pieces in there. The takeaway from this graphic, though, is that education has and continues to be one of the primary drivers in the state budget. You can see right now that education is making up about 32% of that $13.9 billion that I had mentioned. It was interesting to look back at this graphic. I've done this presentation many times over the years, and I was able to look back at a prior year, and I went back to the fiscal year 13 year. And at that time, education actually made up 39% of the state's budget. And so interesting, what we've seen over the years since fiscal year 2013 is we've seen some decline in what the state is providing as far as total percentage of the budget. And in education, so it went from 39 to 32 that we see now. And where did that go? It primarily went to healthcare policy financing, so the healthcare side of the budget. Just interesting to point out that there has been an erosion of the state share for some time, and that has been partially offset by some local property taxes, but this dynamic, the stance between what the state can fund and what we can raise locally continues to be a problem for us and the state. Okay. So let's focus on the School Finance Act itself, and I've intentionally put the site where this comes from. It comes from Title 22, Article 54 of the Colorado Revised Statutes. And in here, this is the Public School Finance Act of 1994. And what this act does is that the Public School Finance Act of Colorado is a formula used to determine state and local funding amounts for the state's 178 districts. Total program is a term used to describe the total amount of money each school district receives under the School Finance Act. So the big takeaway here is that this section of the law drives a very large percentage of our budget. Again, 73% comes from the School Finance Act. The other takeaway is that this funding formula not only applies to us, but it applies to all 178 districts in Colorado. So those two pieces are important, and this is going to be where a lot of focus is with the legislature around possible changes in this School Finance Act itself. So at a very high level, and this graphic doesn't quite do the formula justice. The formula is actually fairly detailed. There's a lot of lines, there's a lot of calculations behind it, but at its core, this graphic describes the components that we think about when we talk about total program. And you hear me talk a lot about the first two here, and that is funded pupil count and our per pupil funding amounts. So our funded pupil count is one side of this equation that is multiplied by the funding amount. So it is very important. That's why in October, when we do our October count, it's important for us to count the kids. We report those to the state, and that becomes part of this calculation that the state uses, is funded pupils. That is then multiplied against total per pupil funding, of which includes multiple components, base funding, it includes our at-risk funding, and then there's a layering on of online funding, of which gets treated a little bit differently. We're going to see this in some more detail when I look at the funded pupil count. The key takeaway from this graphic, though, is that really, when we think about it, 73% of our budget comes from taking our funded pupil count times a per pupil amount to drive the total per pupil revenue. So let's look a little bit closer at the driver of the total program formula and understand maybe some of the things that might be moving around on us as the legislature takes on their work this session. The first thing is that all 178 districts start out with base funding. So all funded pupils in Colorado get a base funding amount. And for our current fiscal year, that's $7,478. So every student theoretically in the state is funded at this level. On top of the funding, on top of the base funding, what the state does is they begin to layer in adjustments to base funding, because if we just stopped at base funding, everybody would get an equal amount per kid. But the state makes adjustments because not all districts are alike, and we have 178 districts in Colorado. So this is where, in my opinion, we have the most opportunity for change in the legislative session, and is in these factors under the per pupil funding. So I want to talk through each one of them in some summary fashion. I want to talk, but the takeaway is that what I say today may change as the legislature does their work. The first one is a cost of living factor, and I also added and personnel cost factor. Those two go hand in hand, and what this adjustment in the School Finance Act is trying to do is to recognize that there are cost differentials across districts. And so the state does a cost of living study every 2 years. There's probably some politics bound up in the cost of living study, because Poudre School District, typically, we do get a cost of living adjustment, and it has been increasing a little bit over time. But our cost of living adjustment, as we compare to our peers in the metro areas, specifically DPS, Aurora, I mean, you can count all the big districts in the metro area. Most of those are getting a much larger cost of living factor, which makes it harder for us to be comparable to them. And that factors into our budget, so we get less budget potentially from the cost of living factor. That is definitely one that I would earmark that we may be hearing more about as the legislature does their work. There likely will and have been in the past, when the legislature has taken up this task of looking at the school finance formula. There have been some talk about adjustments to the cost of living factor. So that might be something that's on our horizon. Oh, I'm sorry. Does that help?
Yep.
Thank you. Thanks, Jim. All right. So cost of living factor is the first one there, and so that's what I just talked about there. The second factor is the size factor, and the size factor is one, again, we don't really make a lot. We get a size adjustment, but we're a large district, so we don't get a very large size adjustment. What the size adjustment is doing in the state formula is it's trying to compensate for efficiencies of scale. So larger districts can cover costs theoretically more efficiently than a smaller district that is maybe operating on a large geographic area, or maybe only has 60 kids in their entire district. The cost drivers are very different as you look at those two entities. And so the state is trying to adjust for that in a size factor. Again, we do get a size factor, but our size factor is on the small end because we're a large district. Some of the small districts, especially on the Eastern Plains, they get a significant size adjustment because the efficiencies of running those districts is just enormous. When you think about having a geographic area maybe as large as Poudre School District and running transportation and everything else for 60 kids, the costs are much higher than it is for a larger district to kind of absorb those. The last piece that I think is probably up for some adjustment is the at-risk, well, definitely the at-risk funding adjustment. And the state here in the formula is trying to compensate for the understanding that districts have different concentrations of at-risk students. And why this is so important this year is I think most are aware that on the ballot, universal feeding is going to be a thing next year. The state recognized that, and I think they even had an interim committee looking at this. They were already understanding they probably would need to adjust the at-risk factor, because if you think it through logically, yes, we're going to be able to direct certify a number of kids for National School Lunch, but we won't have all the free lunch applications potentially that were there in the past. I just don't think the incentive is going to be there for students that aren't directly certified to certify, and I think the state recognizes that and has begun looking at alternatives to the at-risk funding. And when you think about it, that's really what's causing this legislative review of the school finance formula. They first started with the at-risk funding, and then I believe in November or December we got notice that the legislature was going to take on more than the at-risk funding and actually look at the entire formula. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for a shuffling of how these resources are determined in the school finance formula, and we're going to have to pay really close attention to that as it develops in the legislature. We do get funding for online students. It's a little different. It's a separate per pupil amount. I haven't heard much about changes there, so I don't think there's going to be a lot of change there. There is some budget stabilization factor. So there's this concept of a budget stabilization factor where, and we have a graphic on this, but this is, long and the short of this is the amount that the state cannot afford to pay us and has been withholding from their state equalization. So yes, I would imagine, and the governor has proposed some changes to this already, but I think, again, the rewrite of the formula is going to be the first three factors: the cost of living factor, the size, and the at-risk. And to just kind of come back through that again, cost of living, we do get a cost of living factor, but it's not like the ones that Boulder, Denver, and our other peer districts get. Size factor, we get a small size factor because we're a large district. And at-risk funding, we do have at-risk students in our district, but we don't have high concentrations that you might find in some of our other peer districts. So when you total all that up, we come up with a calculation that is provided across all 178 districts. And just some statistics here for you to understand kind of the magnitude. That range of the formula goes anywhere from $9,004 all the way up to $20,565 per student. Again, the $20,000 district is going to be the small district on the Eastern Plains that probably has 50, 60 kids in it. Most of those higher funded districts are going to be those smaller districts. The majority of our larger districts are closer to the bottom range. Average across all districts is 12,257. But it doesn't end there. There's actually a provision that's been in state law for a while now that gives Poudre School District and 13 other districts a little additional money in the way of what they call a minimum program funding. And so in this idea here, what we do is we take those calculations. The state has a really big spreadsheet that they track all 178 districts in. But what they do is they calculate an average per pupil across the entire state. And the state law, what it dictates is that 95% of that average will become a minimum. And so that's how Poudre School District, and you've heard me refer to this before, has become a floor district. And so what's happening is when you take all the cost of living factor, the size, the at-risk, the base funding, what's generated in the formula for us based on the factors that we have does not get to 95% of the statewide average. And so we get a little bit more of a bump to get up to $9,068 per pupil. And this is all after the budget stabilization factor. There are 13 districts that are currently projected to receive minimum program funding. PSD is one of them. And I was actually talking to our lobbyist about this the other day. We've actually been on the floor since the inception of this law. I remember when they passed it, and we were one of the first districts on the floor, and we have not come off the floor since. We have always been a floor-funded district, and it really goes back to, again, those factors: cost of living, at-risk, and size, and how they play out for us. Okay. So we've talked a lot about total program funding and how we get 73% of our budget. There's another point that I want to make the board aware of, because I think it will become something that's talked about during the legislative session, so we need to just keep our eyes on it. And I alluded to it earlier. Total program is funded by a combination of state share and local property taxes. And the way the formula works is we determine what the program amount is, we subtract out what our local property taxes are, and then the state equalizes or backfills the difference. Why this is important is when we look at this pie chart that shows our general fund total program. So this isn't general fund, this is just total program. And when you look at the components of it, you can see that about 43% come from property taxes or specific ownership taxes. The majority of it is property taxes. You can see 40% there. That brings in about $105 million to the district, $8 million for the specific ownership side. On the other side of this pie chart, so 43% is property tax, 57% is the state share or the state equalization. So this is state revenue that is coming to our school district to make us whole under the total program formula. And why this is important is, and we know that this year is going to be a reassessment year. So we've already heard that property tax valuations are going up. I heard Governor Polis talk during one of his addresses where they recognize that assessed valuation is growing at a very fast pace. What happens in that environment sometimes is that the property tax section, or the 40% of the pie there, the yellow or the gold bar, that'll grow. And sometimes that means that the state has a decision to make. We can reduce our share, or we can continue funding our share. And that will be a topic that comes up during the legislative process this year as well, as to how much of that property tax is going to be supporting next year, and how much state equalization needs to fill in on the other side. If you look at it from a purely formulaic standpoint, you would expect that the gold pie, or the property tax portion of the pie, would grow, and that the state equalization would shrink. Okay? But I think that's going to be a topic for the legislature, is that really what needs to happen? And I guess that we're going to have the politicians at the Capitol figure that out with some input from us, obviously. But we obviously would like to keep that state equalization where it is and allow the property tax to even float us up higher. So that was the point of the graphic there. And again, I want us just to have these, be armed with some of these facts so that we understand as they're rolling out from the legislature what it means. To be complete on total program, I would be remiss if I didn't come back to the budget stabilization factor, or for us old people, we used to call it the negative factor way back in the day. And this graphic is it's an interesting chart. What it does is it represents the percentage of negative factor, budget stabilization factor that was applied to each fiscal year. And it's presented in the form of a percentage, so you don't see the bars growing because revenue would be growing. But what it does is it does show us how the budget stabilization factor has changed over time. When it was first brought into existence back in fiscal year 11, the budget stabilization factor was about $18.8 million for Poudre School District. It got as deep 2 years later in fiscal year 13 to being $32 million in one fiscal year. Now, roll the clock forward from fiscal year 13 all the way forward a decade, and you can see that that has shrunk quite a bit. It's now 2% of the PPR funding. And this is a very concerted effort on the state's part to be buying down the negative factor, and we've seen that happen a couple years in a row. Next year's forecast or budget proposal from the governor has even further reduction to the negative factor, so I think we're seeing this trend where we're trying to move away and get past the budget stabilization idea. The biggest takeaway from this graphic, and it kind of I kind of fell out of my chair a little bit when our budget director brought it forward, is that over time we have actually lost $336 million as Poudre School District from the budget stabilization factor. And that's not that far off from our annual budget. So that's pretty amazing when you think about how much we as a state have not been able to do since the recession of 9/10. So I've talked a lot about total program. I do want to hit some categorical program funding elements because they are also going to be topics for the legislature this year. Some of them are already out there in draft form. We do have 6 primary categorical programs that we fund in Poudre School District, or that the state funds us on. Special education, English Language Proficiency Act, gifted and talented, transportation, vocational education, and small attendance centers. Most of them are self-explanatory. The small attendance centers is a very small amount of revenue that we get for operating some of our mountain schools. And so the state continues to fund that. It's not a big piece of our budget, but that's the one question I get a lot is, what is that? For the legislative session this year, the focus is going to be primarily, from what we can tell now, on special education. And this is a continued effort from last year. In our current fiscal year, last legislative session, the legislature made a very noticeable change to the categorical for special education, and that actually yielded about $2.1 million for us this year, which is allowing us to increase our ratios for special education and doing some amazing things there. The takeaway for this session is that there is currently a bill out there that is going to further enhance that categorical even further. That's good news for us. And so I obviously appreciative of the legislature for moving forward in that direction. We're going to have to wait and see if it passes. It's a bill out there right now. I did hear in talking with people at the Capitol that most decisions on bills that have money will not be made until the forecast comes out in March, the state forecast, March 20th. So that might just be in limbo for a little bit until we see what that forecast number comes out at the state. Currently, this might yield another $1 million for us in Poudre School District. So over the course of 2 years, that's a $3.1 million increase to a program-specific categorical. The other note is I am hearing some rumor of possibly some conversation about changing the transportation categorical, but I think it's more rumor at this point, but we'll be paying attention to that, see if there's something that gains some traction at the state. So I can go through this quickly because I've been threading this all through the presentation. So the governor, potential legislative changes, the big pieces, the 3 bullet points that I think we're focusing on are the governor's continued strategy to buy down the budget stabilization factor by he slated a year of 25, 26. So again, you saw that budget stabilization factor has been slowly been lowered, and this would be a continued effort on the governor's behalf there. The second bullet point is potential changes to school finance rewrite. We don't have a lot of details right now, and I did call to see if there were any more details before the board meeting tonight. We're anxiously waiting for bills to get dropped. There's a lot of rumor, there's a lot of ideas of what these new formulas might look like, and we're going to have to wait and see. So I've heard all sorts of different options, but we know something's coming, so we're going to be paying attention to that. The reality is this is being influenced by the need to relook at the at-risk factor. So I think it's going to be something that the legislature has to take on. Interesting, in the past, there was a point where the legislature redid the school finance formula. Some may even remember this. It was sitting in Colorado law for a while, but it was dependent on a revenue or a ballot passing. And so there was actually another formula in the law for a number of years. It ended up sunsetting because the ballot never passed. So they have taken attempts at this before. They've actually got them into law. So I do think that this one is going to happen, though, unlike the other ones in the past. And then the last point is that we do expect that there will be continued enhancement of the special ed categorical. Okay. So that gets us through the kind of the foundational setting of how the school finance formula works on a very basic understanding, so that I think you can be conversant as changes happen at the Capitol. I know many of you are plugged into those efforts down there. So now what I'd like to do is shift gears to looking at a possible revenue scenario. This has been updated since the last time we may have talked, and it's going to be new for some of the staff that we've been looking at budget internally. So this is a new document. And what we're looking at here is the first piece. Remember, I talked about there's 2 components that we really need to know. We need to know how many kids we have and then how much they're going to be funded. So we're first looking at how do we calculate the number of kids we're going to be funded at. We continue, and you can see on the data here that we are projecting a decline in enrollment next year. But the good news from a school funding formula perspective, I mean, that's not good news for us as a district, because that is going to have an impact on us eventually. But the state does slow that progression some, and what they do is they allow us to calculate an average. And so what we've done here is we've just calculated that average based on our prior and our current projection. That gets us to a 5-year average of 28,556 kids. The averaging only applies to certain kids. There's a number of kids that we count that it doesn't apply to, and so we group those into another category because it doesn't apply. But early childhood fits in there. Ascent is another program where we get funded for kids. And then our online program, of which doesn't necessarily follow the exact same formula, but it ends up being very similar in the end. But the important number for us is to understand what that average might look like. And so as we look at this, our projected average for next year would be 29,214 with the state averaging calculated in. Okay? that would be a 179 funded pupil count decline from the current year, about a 0.6% decline. So we need that piece of information to go to the next slide. And what this next slide is going to do is it's going to, again, we're talking about 73% of our revenue here. So, and the reality is the calculation, while there's a lot of detail behind the big calculation that the state uses, it for the most part will land in this vicinity. We can see that we've taken that 0.6% decline in funded pupils. What we've done is compared our current per pupil revenue, and the state recently provided what they call a run. It's a calculation. It's that big spreadsheet I'm talking about. And in that run, we were able to pull out the revised governor's budget proposal around PPR. And right now, that is looking to be about $9,956, or about a 10% increase. And the big driver behind the per pupil revenue increase there is the inflation rate that's applied to the base unit. So every year, the base is increased by inflation. Right now, and the inflation rate's going to be out real soon here, but right now the projection was that the inflation rate was about 8.2%. So we'll fine tune that once that's actually released. But what you're seeing is about 8% inflation, and then there's the differential is the buy down of the budget stabilization factor that the governor proposed in that proposal. If you do this basic calculation, and again, I want to emphasize this is basic, there's more to it. We get an estimated increase in revenue of about $24 million, okay, which is a very big number for us. That's larger than we typically are talking about in our budget forecasting and planning, and it's really being driven by the inflation rate, the 8% inflation. So that's kind of what we know at this point. I would expect that there's going to be a lot of information coming in the next couple of weeks and the next 2 months specifically around what might shake out with the school finance formula, and we'll be paying very close attention to that. I'd like to orient us back to, as we wind down this presentation, our district budget priorities. So as we think about new revenue coming into the district, we have a number of priorities that we need to consider. We've been talking about the top 4 priorities for quite a bit, but I'm going to focus on them again. And they're the ones that are aligned to our strategic plan. So we have 4: literacy, graduate with options, mental health and belonging, and safety. We also talked about having some other budget priorities. Integrated services was one, and that was in direct in relation to understanding that categorical revenue was increasing there. Competitive compensation and benefits is a big portion of our budget. 86% of our budget is people, or salaries and compensation and benefits. So for that not to be on there is it's hard not to have that on there. Impact of universal pre-K and universal feeding are other budget priorities, and we're continuing to work through those as the state gives us more information around how those programs might develop next year and how they might work. We also have an other with a question mark behind it for priorities, because there are other priorities that are being identified as we go through our budget process, and we wanted to make sure we had an avenue for those to come forward as needed. But again, I think we visited these priorities in December, and so they haven't changed since that time. The last part of this presentation, I just want to briefly go over our timeline. Just orienting the board that we really started our budget process back in November, where we started to have cabinet identify budget priorities. We also had negotiations starting up at that time, and we had the negotiations, you can see at the green bar way at the bottom. We had negotiations, compensation committee start up in November as well, to start talking about compensation early in the budget process. We've moved past January, where we continued to fine tune those items, and we began convening the budget design team. Also working at the same time, down at the bottom, you can see that we have the strategic planning efforts being taken place over January, February, and into March. And then we have January and February where the DAC and SACs are providing some budget input to us. And then the blue bar along the bottom represents the legislative session, of which I talked a lot about how that's going to be something we're paying attention to during the budget process. So now we're in February, and a few things have happened. We have released budgets to schools based on the projected counts, and those went out in the form of student-based budgeting. We have been visiting with schools about preliminary allocations for integrated services, representing an increase from some of that categorical. So that's good news that's been happening in real time as we're talking with our principals. And then we're going to continue our efforts around BDT, the strategic plan efforts to work the budget process going forward. Negotiations is a big part of that, obviously, taking place in March, April, and May, while we're also going to have the strategic action plans working in March, and we're going to be reviewing comp plans from schools in March. So that would be when our schools take their SBB plans, they bring their comp plans in, and then the assistant soups, myself, and other folks in the district work through those plans in real time and ask questions and provide input. What we're trying to get to is a budget that we can put together by May, and my hope is that we can get there. The big question is the legislature going to give us enough information to make that decision? I'm hoping that we can forecast that with some confidence and that we can make some decisions before then, but I want to prepare people that the legislature could change that. And so we'll just have to pay very close attention to that. Our goal would be to wrap up both negotiations and the budget process by mid-May. And if the session ends when it should, that might be possible. There is the possibility, if the legislature goes deep, that they might go past their end date, and that would push our date back a little bit further as well. At the end of the day, we need to adopt a budget by law by the end of June before we start the next fiscal year. So we will have a budget that we bring forward, and I'm hoping that we'll have all the pieces by that time. In June, we should. And then we can bring that budget forward to the board for adoption at that point. That's a overview of the budget timeline process and where we're going. I can take any questions at this point.
Any questions from board members? Go ahead, Carolyn.
So you talked a little bit about how the recession affected our budget and how hard it's been for us to recover from that. The state economy has come roaring back, so can you explain why the school financing didn't come back as quickly as the economy?
Yeah, and so I think there's a lot of complication to the economy and how much of that gets to be spent in the budget. Currently, the state budget is forecasting Tabor refunds still, and so Tabor is a big portion of that there's a certain amount that the state can spend, and Tabor is a big part of that. Also, I think as we looked at the state budget picture, we see that the state is reprioritizing where they're putting resource. We saw education declined a little bit, and we saw that, well, quite a bit, and we saw healthcare increase. So I think that there's a lot of answers, a lot of pieces to that, but those are the two that really drive to the top of my head.
Other questions from the board? DJ?
I don't expect you necessarily have an answer for this right away, but are you able to run to show how much we are missing out from federal dollars by not having IDA fully funded? Is that possible with our system?
I do a calculation. I've done it before in the fall, where we calculate the revenue coming in and the cost for special ed. So I could revisit that and see if that gets to what but I don't think that's
Okay.
your question.
Yeah, I want to be able to hold up, I guess, in front of some of them, how much money should be coming into our community and into our school system and for our students. So I don't know if that's even
And that's based
possible.
on what the federal government at one point had promised, 40%
Yeah.
of the funding to special education, and that's so I can look at that and see
Yeah.
what the differential is between that.
Yeah, and we're like at 13-14%. So, yep. Okay, cool. Thanks.
Other comments? Kristen, do you have one?
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you so much for that, like, really clear presentation, I think, to the community about how the dollars come in and how they can get spent. And I think a great overall takeaway on that is that over the last 10 years, we've gone down 7% in spending in education from the state. So that's quite a bit. And I think it's really good for our community to understand that. So thank you.
Yeah, I do want to make sure, because we saw the state decline, but some of that is in the form of property tax. So there's that dance between property tax and state share that's taking place in there too. So it's important I was looking at a state chart. We did get some of that funding in the form of property taxes though, so.
But what I'm saying is that the state as a whole did 37% or 39% of education,
Yep.
and now it's doing 32%.
32,
So,
that's exactly the
yeah,
takeaway.
so that's a big takeaway.
Yeah.
Anything else? Go ahead, DJ.
I'll just hop on back that too, is that these are services that our community and people want and need. And there is a big fight for those. And in that pie chart, higher education was at 10%. Somewhere in the last 10 years, that was down to 8% too at one point. And so, they got a little bit more back, but that and the human sources are huge ones that we need to take care of our people. And so, again, this comes down to how our tax policy works a little bit at the state level and how we need to adjust that and update it. But as I just wanted to point out all those other aspects and how important it is to get our public education funded correctly so that we can not only take care of our kids, but it takes care of our communities by making sure that funding is in our communities. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Seeing no other comments, I will add my thanks to you, Dave, and to your staff. Very educational presentation, well done, and we appreciate all the work that goes into the work behind the slides, actually getting the budget together. So thank you, and thanks for all the folks on the budget development team and obviously in the finance department. So thank you.
Get that.